we were discussing that man was created in the image of God. As Hashem had said to the angels, Nasa odom b'tzalmeinu b'buseinu, let us make man in our image and our form. The initial intent of creation was that God should be on the terrestrial level and have a relationship with the human being, because the human being is in his image and his form. Although God has no image and has no form, because God is infinite, what it means, the human being is endowed with intelligence and is endowed with the ability to take control and override what is instinctive, and he's able to go in either direction, either choose to do the right thing and override his inclination, or he goes with the flow. Many years ago, Rav Noach Weinberg, who was the one who founded the yeshiva in Israel for Balei Tshuva, Eshet Torah, he used to say, how do you tell the difference between a dead fish and a live fish? He says, a live fish swims upstream. A dead fish goes with the flow. A human being has the ability to take control and go against the grain. And choice is to go, not to do what you're inclined to do, but to do what you're meant to do. And what is the meaning? What is meant to do? God wrote the script. What you're meant to do is do the will of God, to subjugate all your ability, your intellect, and all your drives. But how do you dedicate your drives? Meaning that despite you have personal interests, you override those interests, you negate those interests for God. That's the power of choice. So choice is not to do what you want to do in terms of inclination-wise, but to do what God wants you to do. And that's what a person is what's meant to do and meant to be. As we mentioned, the relationship initially was God was meant to be on the terrestrial level in the Garden of Eden together with Adam. But because Adam ate of the tree of knowledge and he allowed this evil, which was contained within the fruit of knowledge, which is a tree of good and evil, and he intermingled it and he meshed it and he embedded it in every aspect of physicality. Therefore, the world, as I mentioned, became putrefied. Man became putrefied. The world became putrefied. God ascended and detached himself from this existence, not to dwell in this existence. The first time from then going forward, the God descended into existence, which had relevance to the original intent of creation, was Sinai. As the Torah tells us, God brought heaven to earth. God's divine presence rested on the mountain. The world quaked, but that was only for the moment. But ultimately, to take on a permanent residence, that was the time of the Mishkan. Make for me the sanctuary, I will dwell in your midst. Because the Jews themselves assumed the profile and the persona of Adam pre-sin when they received the Torah at Sinai and they became God's priestly heavenly people, Mamlechus Kohen Kodosh, holy people. That's when we assume the profile of Adam. God created the world. He has a relation with Adam on the terrestrial level. Therefore, on the 8th day of the inauguration of the Mishkan, when the Mishkan took on a permanent status, the Midrash tells us, the Talmud tells us, it was the joy that God had when he created existence, the same joy. Because what was the joy of originally? That God descended into this existence to be on the terrestrial level. The first time since then, when the Mishkan took on that permanent status, which was on the 8th day, when Aaron and his sons were installed to be the priests, Aaron to be the high priest. It says, Vayhi b'yom hashmini, it was on the 8th day. And just as it says in time in creation, and it was evening, and it was morning, and it was whatever day it was, identically, this day was the equivalent of the day of creation. And therefore, God's joy was overwhelming because now it's been reinstated, the original intent of creation, because the Jew himself is the equivalent of Adam having that potential to bring about perfection in existence, which the non-Jew no longer has that. Because as I mentioned, Adam became disenfranchised when he ate of the tree of knowledge. The circumcision, as we mentioned, in the name of the Zohar, which is cited by the Or Chaim HaKodesh, is we achieved through Avram's initiative, introducing God to existence, giving his life for God. He assumed the level of Adam personally, and therefore he was given the mitzvah, the commandment of remove that foreskin. A non-Jew removes this foreskin, it's purely cosmetic. The Jew removes the foreskin because we have the spiritual genetics of Avram. It actually impacts and it actually minimizes the evil that's embedded in all mankind. And therefore, we have greater control over our life for that reason. We know that Avram had a name change. Initially, his name was Avram, Abram, and it became Avraham, Abraham. The letter He was added to his name. We say every morning in the morning service, Atuhu Hashem Elokim Hashem Bocharta ba'Avram. You, God, you chose Avram. And you took him out of the kiln of Kasdim, and you called him Avraham. When you took him out of the kiln, he became Avraham. The Korasa Shemo Avraham. It's a verse in Prophets. He took Avram out of the kiln and he called him Avraham. And you found his heart faithful to you. He's willing to go into the kiln, not to bow to the idol, which was pagan worship. So there's an obvious question. How old was Avram when he went to the kiln? He was only 75 years old. He did not become Abraham, until he was 99 years old. So, but yet the prophet says, you are God who took him out of the kiln, as initially as Avram, without the hay, the Karosa Shmo Avraham, and you called his name Abraham. But Abraham didn't have it right as soon as he came out of the kiln. You know, we always speak about trajectories. He's on a trajectory. At the age of 99, Avram reached that critical point of he's ready for that transition into another dimension of person, which we spoke about in the name of the Midrash, that Avram, when he became Avraham, he was the equivalent of an ex nihilo, the beginning of a new creation. His dimension of spirituality did not precede him. But when did the trajectory start? When he was willing to die, to sanctify God's name, not to bow to the idol, and reject paganism, which became world knowledge, because it was a public event. And he came out alive and unsinged. He called him Avraham. Because of that event, now there is a trajectory. There's an ascent. The ascent took till 99, where Avram continuously met various challenges. Either the first challenge was coming out of the kiln or leaving the land of his birth, his family. That was all part of the ascent. The Akedah was beyond. He already was Avraham. Now, what did the prophet say? What do we say every morning after you called him Avraham? V'chorosi ba'bris. God entered into a covenant with him to give him what? The land of Canaan. And the verse delineates all the nations of Canaan. What are the nations of Canaan? What do they represent? They represent the evil. The evil that exists within its existence. Because he was called Avram and he went out of the kiln, therefore God entered into the kiln, entered into the covenant to give him the land of the 7 nations of Canaan. And what is the law when we conquer the nations of Canaan? We have to annihilate them. That's expunging existence from this representation of evil. But he was only given that task because it was within his capacity to achieve that task. Because he reached that critical level of spirituality that he was able to suppress and conquer and vanquish that representation of evil from existence. Therefore, one was a direct outgrowth of the other. And that is the objective of the Jewish people, to intensify God's presence in this world, intensify spirituality, which ultimately will cause the vanquishing of the representation of evil. What will happen at the end of time? There's a positive commandment to annihilate the Amalekites. Of all the nations, there's no nation which represents evil as the Amalekites represented. They attacked us right after the splitting of the sea. Haman, the first time in the history of existence, because the Persian king ruled the world supreme and he was the viceroy, his objective was that there should not be one solitary Jew on the face of the earth. And the decree was given to annihilate every man, woman, and child from the face of the earth. And that's what Amalek is. It's a level of intolerance for God's presence to such a degree. Hitler, Yamach Shmo v'Zichro, his name should be obliterated forever, wanted to bring about the same result. He called it the final solution. Because again, he is a representation of that level of evil. The objective of the Jewish people was to destroy that representation and anything that has relevance to that representation. And at the end of time, what's going to happen? We said every day in the Psukei de Zimra, in the verses of praise, V'olu Moshim Lishmoras Har Esav. At the end of time, the saviors will come to judge the Mount Esav. And then God will be coronated by the whole world to be the king. And that will come through the Messiah, who's known as Melech Mashiach, the anointed king. That's going to be the objective, to purge the world of all evil, and it will no longer be evil. But where did it all start? You had to have a representation of that special level of holiness, of spirituality, that started with Avram, going from Avram to Avraham. When that transition took place, he became Abraham. Avram became the equivalent of Adam at that point. As we said, every relationship is based on compatibility between two individuals. Compatibility. What is the basis for compatibility? Commonality. Avram achieved a level of commonality with God. When he was circumcised, Avram numerically is Ramach, 248. He became complete in his physicality and his spirituality at that moment. He reflected God's perfection. God is perfect on the absolute level. The Jew is perfect within the human context. You can't be more perfect than that. When the Jew circumcises himself, he becomes 248. He becomes that complete individual. He becomes the equivalent of Adam before the sin. That's what the Jew is. Avram became that. When Avram had hosted the angels. We asked the question, his whole life was doing acts of loving kindness. And all of a sudden, fast forward to the age of 99, he's circumcised. Every detail of that loving kindness is evaluated, analyzed, and it has such far-reaching value that the Jewish people for 40 years were protected by the clouds of glory because he had offered the shade of his tree to these three angels who he believed were humans. And he offered his bread to them. We merited the manna. And he offered the water. We merited the wellspring of Miriam. What about all the other chesed? All the other loving kindness he did, all the hospitality. Now, who's doing the hospitality at this moment? It's not Avram, it's Avraham. Who is Avraham? Avraham is a person who reflects God's unity, God's profile in existence. So based on that concept, if he's reflecting God, that means his level of association with God is a special level. Therefore, his action takes on a different dimension of value because he is the equivalent of God's representation on this existence. Therefore, this chesed, although it may be offering the same bread and the same shade as anybody else will, but who's offering it? This person is a reflection of God's existence in terms of that level of perfection, of completion. He achieved that special level of spirituality, which is the beginning of the trajectory for the Jews to stand at Sinai, and the whole nation should reflect that level of perfection through the study of Torah. Therefore, this chesed at this moment is different than any other chesed. You can have two human beings. We share the same human characteristics, but what is the essence of the person? Essence of the person is spirituality, his soul. The body is only to facilitate the objective of the soul, the mission of the soul. The mission of the Jewish soul is not the mission of the non-Jewish soul. Therefore, the chesed, the same bread that Avram offered is a different bread than someone else offered. Different bread. It's interesting. The Talmud tells us, the Midrash tells us, there are a number of people who are born circumcised. They needed no circumcision. Who are they? Yaakov was born circumcised. Yaakov is the most special of the patriarchs. If we're saying that the foreskin is the representation of the evil which is expressed as a result of the tree of knowledge, if Yaakov was born circumcised, what does it say about Yaakov? He was born with an advanced spiritual capacity from birth. The other person who was born circumcised was Yosef, his favorite son, who was meant to be his successor. He's the son who literally looked like him, facially speaking. He was the son who was the wisest of all his sons. Did not have a foreskin. Who's the next person? Next person was Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was born without a foreskin. What does that say, Moshe? Moshe was the most perfect human being ever to walk the face of the earth. And as I mentioned yesterday, Moshe, when his parents married, they're not identified by name. It says, a person from the house of Levi had gone to take the daughter of Levi. Doesn't mention their names. So I had explained the name of the Maharal of Prague, because Moshe, very often a child, his characteristics is somehow attributed to the mother and the father. Moshe Rabbeinu, who he was, his soul had no relevance to either of the parents. Therefore, they're mentioned anonymously. Later, the Torah reveals who these people were. But in terms of the time of conception, the people who he was conceived through had no relevance to who he was. Of course, they raised him, they reared him, but his potential, whatever he was, is unrelated to his parents. He had to be brought into existence, so there had to be parenting that had happened, but unrelated. He was born without a foreskin. David HaMelech, King David, David Melech Shel Chai V'Kayom, the most spiritual king, the Messiah who's going to come from the Davidic line, the author of Tehillim, the language with which we speak to God, which is Tehillim, Psalms. That's David HaMelech. David Melech Yisrael, he's the king. Again, born without a foreskin. All this emphasizes and confirms their innate level of spirituality which each of these people possessed. Although within their genetics that children did have foreskins, but it only indicates the dimension of soul which each of them possessed. Therefore, the Torah focuses on the chesed, the loving kind hospitality of Avram at this point. And that's why it had those far-reaching consequences, ramifications, which all the chesed done previously did not, because he was a different human being. His physicality was the same, except for being circumcised. But in terms of his level of representation, it was different. Now, there's a question which always bothered me. We'd speak about what's the difference between creation and formation. The word creation is bria, to be borei. Yitzira is formation. After you have the various components, you form them, you combine them, and you create an entity. But whatever was formed was the makeup is what preceded it before. You just molded it and coalesced it to be something else. Okay? But Bria, creation was ex nihilo, that was the beginning of creation. But yet every day, we say in the blessing of Kriya Shema, of Shema, we say, Borei Refuos. God creates healing. That means today. A person is not well. The reason why you recover is because God is Borei Refuos. He creates healing. What do you mean he creates healing? Everything else, it's called formation. When it comes to healing, the word is create. Why is it create? It should say Yotzer. We say Yotzer Hamoros. He formed the luminaries. Osa Chadoshos. Matzmiach Yeshuos. Borei Refuos. He creates healing. And it always bothered me, this question. And just recently, I came to an understanding. Now, we had mentioned that even among Jews, every soul has its own mission, has its own spiritual makeup. Of course, it's a soul that's of the similar dimension, but in terms of what it represents, what it needs to perfect it, it needs the positive and negative commandments, not to violate all these, relatively speaking, unlimited negative commandments and positive plans to advance it. Every Jewish soul needs it, okay? But nevertheless, each soul is unique. No two people have an identical mission. There are nuances of difference. Only God knows. And to achieve those and the nuances of difference, to be able to bring it to fruition, you're endowed with so many years of life, so many months of life, so many weeks of life, so many hours of life, so many minutes of life, and so many seconds of life, and even less than that, down to the nanosecond. Of course, all that's necessary for you to fulfill your mission. We had mentioned in the name of Rav Chaim of Volozhin, when it says in Pirkei Avos, mitzvah goreres mitzvah, one mitzvah engenders another mitzvah. And Aveiro Gores Aveiro. And one sin engenders another. What does that mean? So Rav Chaim of Volozhin cites a Zohar that when a person does a mitzvah, the mitzvah itself creates a mega positive spiritual energy that we can't even relate to. And the majority of that energy detaches from this existence and is put in another realm of existence called the world to come, and a spiritual existence. Of course, that energy is spiritual. However, there's a trace of that energy that remains with the person, which motivates the person, engulfs the person to do more of the same. That's called positive energy. These are positive forces. What about if a person sins, transgresses? And it's all based on the level of transgression. As I said, A person could transgress inadvertently, deliberately, defiantly, but based on every level that a person transgresses, that will determine the intensity of that impure force. So when we sin, we create an impure force. It's called a nether force, an impure force, a contaminated force. That's what we create. That impure force is a consequence of what? Of the soul. That emanates from the soul. Of course, it's through the physicality we transgress. But who transgressed? The person transgressed. Who's the person? That means the soul. So the sin, what is sin? Sin is that impurity that's created by the what? When you transgress, you create that level of impurity. That impurity reflects the spirituality of that soul. When we speak about illness, illness is only a consequence of sin. It's the way the consequence can manifest itself that it compromises the person. As we said, if not for the attribute of mercy, a person could not survive. That level of impurity, it would totally sap his soul that the person would die. God sustains that impurity to give a person the ability to repent and to continue with life, to do good things. Otherwise, a person couldn't survive that level of impurity which is created by the soul. So as a result of this, understanding this, each impurity that is created by a sin is unique to the person who creates it. So if it's unique to the person that creates it, if the soul comes into existence now, what is the remedy to heal that soul? Because you're dealing with the basis for the illness, which is that level of impurity. So what does God have to do? Borei Rufus. He has to, it's creation. Because since if this soul was never here before, that means there's a new, as they say, there's a new boy on the block. There's a new kid on the block. He's the way he does things. Nobody ever pre-existed him in this unique profile of soul, of spirituality, which now is generating impure forces, and the illness is only a consequence of that. So how do you arrest that illness? God has to create the healing methodology and process and mechanism because this never existed. It didn't exist pre the person himself because every illness is rooted in the impurity which is produced by that soul, which is generated by that soul. Today, more than ever, the world understands their energy forces. There are forces out there, mega forces. And if you are exposed to certain types of forces, you're impacted positively, negatively. It's a known fact. Known fact. If you know it, it's a known fact that a person who suffers from rheumatoid arthritis, they say that if they wear a copper bracelet on their wrist, or people who suffer from arthritis, serious arthritis, they wear certain metals, and those metals give off a certain aura or something, and that somehow interacts with the function of the body, and somehow it alleviates the pain. Or for the person with rheumatoid arthritis, it does something, whatever it is. Or there's what we call shock therapy. There's certain impulses. It's not only bypass the brain that it doesn't go to the various parts of the body, somehow it responds. But these are all energies. There are energy fields out there. But the real energy field we talk about are the positive energies, negative energies. The positive energies are generated by the Kedusha, by the sanctity. Because when we do what God wants, it activates literally mega forces, positive mega forces. When you do the wrong thing, the sin, mega negative forces. Now it's very interesting. There's an argument, famous argument, that and the way it's not resolved, but there's one opinion. Reb Shimei Choy says that only a Jew, if you come in contact with the remains of a human being, you become contaminated. It's explicit in the Torah. And you come in contact with many things. You become the carcass of an animal, you become contaminated. But the nature of the contamination of a dead animal and a human being is a different level. If one becomes contaminated with any contaminated source, you immerse yourself in the mikveh, in the ritual pool, and you follow the prescription, you come out of there, you've achieved purity. If you come in contact with the dead, there's only way you can be relieved of that impurity. You have to undergo the process of the red heifer. Without the red heifer, you're actually, it attaches itself, it does not release itself. Okay? So we're all contaminated. We have to wait for that level of purification with the coming of Mashiach. That is the next time we're going to have the next red heifer to have that process to achieve purification. Now, a non-Jew only contaminates upon contact. A Jew contaminates even if you're within the same covered area. The intensity of the contamination is you become contaminated. Now, why the Jew only contaminates if you come in contact with the remains? And a Jew, there's such negative impurity given off from the body that even if you're under the same roof, you become contaminated, even if you did not actually come in contact with the body. Why? So the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, also based on the Zohar, explains everything that exists needs a source to be able to sustain its existence. Now, who's the sustainer of existence? God. God sustains everything. Whether it's the microbe, whether it's the largest creature, whether it's the fish, whatever, God is the sustainer. Nothing could exist in God unless God wills that existence. Whether it's the inanimate, the adamant, or the vegetation, whatever it is, everything is willed by God. If God ceases to will it, it doesn't exist. It goes back to ex nihilo, pre-existence. There are nether forces that exist within existence, which represent impure. These nether forces have to be sustained. How are they sustained? They're sustained. Now, what is the mega energy source that exists in the world? More than anything in all the levels of existence, the human soul. The human soul itself, as it says, God blew in his nostrils a soul of life. An animal does not have a soul of life. A human being has a soul of life, whether Jew or non-Jew alike. When a person dies, because the soul is no longer in the body, how do you fend off all these these nether forces? They need a source of life, of nourishment. What do is they attach to the soul of that person. They attach to the body. And because they attach to the body, because that soul is a source of spiritual nourishment, because everything has to be nourished. So when you have an onslaught, mega numbers of these nether forces, what does it generate? It generates contamination. But since the dimension of holiness of the non-Jew is not comparable to the Jew, less nether forces attach themselves, but it's sufficient to the degree that when you come in contact with the remains, you become contaminated. A Jew having the mega source of spiritual energy, because the soul of the Jew is at a dimension that even the greatest angel cannot fathom, its holiness. This is the ultimate level where these nether forces are attracted to, and they latch on. It's like a leech, and they latch on to the Jew, and they come in such overwhelming number that not only are the remains contaminate, but it's such an intensity of impurity that if you're within the atmosphere, environment of the remains, you also become contaminated. So therefore, if you have a roof over the remains of the Jew, you become contaminated. That's only an indication of the degree of what the dimension of that soul is. But again, it all emanates from the there's a balance in the world of holiness and what's unholy, the nether forces versus whatever else. And that's the basis for all contamination. You know that even in fiction, they have, the vampire. The vampire needs blood and attaches itself to the person. The vampire has a representation of something very negative, very ominous. The nether forces are the leeches that attach themselves to the person. That's what these nether forces are. And especially when the person's helpless because he's no longer alive and he no longer has control over his actions, he becomes a victim of these forces. That's why a Jew, when he passes away, you have a shomer. You have somebody who actually watches the remains of the Jew. And the shomer, it's preferable he should study. Because the person watching the body and studying Torah, that actually creates this insular environment for the body that these forces cannot harm the soul of that person. That's the understanding. So again, a Jew after Sinai is, although physically speaking, we're identical to the non-Jew. Although the features, like every ethnic group has its unique features. But in the makeup, it's the same physical makeup. But that's not what the human being is. The human being is his soul. And the soul of the Jew is different than the soul of the non-Jew. The essence of the Jew is his spirituality. The body is there to facilitate that spirituality. So in terms of innate value, the innate value of the Jew is his spirituality. Therefore, the action done by that person or done by an ordinary person, a non-Jew, although it's the same physical action, it's a different reality in terms of what its representation is. Therefore, it generates another level of force, which brings about other levels of result and other levels of ramification. We'll stop here. Last week, we had read at the end of the previous portion how Avram Avinu was told to take his son who was born to him at the age of 100. This is 37 years later, and to bring him as a burnt offering. The Torah tells us, Vayashkim Avram Baboker. Avram rises early in the morning, hitches his own donkey, and it's a 3-day trek. And he takes his 2 attendants with him. Who are the attendants? Besides Yitzhak, which was his son, one was Ishmael, and one was Eliezer. Eliezer, the dedicated servant, slave of Avram. And they take the trek. And Avram doesn't realize where he's going, but he knows ultimately when he reaches the location he's supposed to be, God will give him a sign that he has arrived. He travels 3 days with Yitzchak, and then from a distance, after 3 days, he sees a mountain. On top of the mountain, he sees a cloud. And he says to his 2 attendants, Ishmael, do you see anything above the mountain? Ishmael says, no, he sees nothing. He says to Eliezer, as great as he was, spiritually speaking, do you see anything on top of the mountain? Eliezer says he sees nothing. Okay? He says to Yitzhak, what do you see? He says, I see a cloud on top of the mountain. So Avram says to Yitzhak, let us go. And he says, you 2 stay behind, which means that was a confirmation that they're not privy to be present at the time of the binding of Isaac and when he slaughters him. At this point, he believed he was going to actually slaughter him. He binds him. He's about to slaughter him. An angel calls from heaven withdraw your hand from that lad. Do not slaughter him. Now I see you do not withhold your son from me, and so on and so forth, and you will merit the future. So to reconcile the original promise that he's going to have a child who's going to be the equivalent of the stars of the heaven and the sand and the dust of the earth, is able to come to fruition because he never said he should slaughter them. He says, just bring him up as a burnt offering. Bind him, put him on the altar, and take him down. God never said the words slaughter. That's how we reconcile both statements. On the way to the Akedah, on the way to this, which was the ultimate test, Satan understood that if Avram succeeds in this, forever till the end of time, whenever he comes to prosecute the Jewish people, the merit of the binding of Isaac will silence his prosecution. Therefore, in the worst way, he does not want Avram to succeed. So he will do with whatever he can. So what does he do? At one point, he comes as a raging river. And Avram reaches a point, he's drowning. And Avram raises his eyes to heaven. He says, God, I'm trying to do your will, but I've come to a point I cannot survive this. I am dying. I'm drowning. The moment he said that, the river disappears. And Avram continues. And then finally, the angel calls out, withdraw your hand. But Avram wants to actualize his feelings, to concretize them. So all of a sudden, at a distance, he sees a ram, and the ram is running towards him. So he understands. This ram, as it says in Pirkei Avos, was created at twilight, right before Shabbos, Friday afternoon, the sixth day of creation. This is a special ram. This ram is going to be brought in the place of Yitzchak. What does that mean? When Avram slaughtered that ram, he says, let it be valued as if I'm slaughtering my own son. Because I would have, if you wouldn't have said I should withdraw my hand. When I receive its blood, it's like I'm receiving the blood of Yitzchak. When I sprinkle the blood, it's like the blood of my son. When I burn the ram on the altar, it's the equivalent of burning my son on the altar. That's the understanding. But all of a sudden, the ram is running towards him, and the ram is intercepted. And the Torah tells us it's caught in the thicket. Meaning Satan didn't want him to concretize and actualize those feelings in the ram. So he tried even that to prevent that from happening. And therefore, the Torah tells us Avram went to the thicket and took the ram out of the thicket and brought the ram as the sacrifice. Could you imagine if we would be put in this situation to be tested, and all of a sudden we do our best, we rise early, every level of preparation, and we're on the trip, and then afterwards something happens, the axle of the car breaks, and you can't go further. What do you say? Do you pray to God, God, perform a miracle that a repair man should come immediately fix the axle? You say, God, I did my best. I was willing to bring my child as a sacrifice. And evidently, it wasn't meant to be. If the river's coming, raging that he's drowning, what should Avram say? God, I tried. I would have, and you know I would have. I'm going home with my son. But that's not what Avram said. I've come to a point, I'm drowning. I want to do your will. You're not allowing me to do your will. The river disappears. The first moment we'd have a reason to go back and to say we've done our best, we leave it at that. Avram, no. Avram knows the will of God is that he should be brought as a sacrifice. That's his will. Therefore, what does he pray for? That the river should disappear. And the river does disappear. And he's able to actually carry it out. But what's the end result? He succeeded. He beat Satan. He beat him at his own game. From now on, going forward, if Satan would ever prosecute the Jewish people, as he does, every Rosh Hashanah, which is the day of judgment, which, as the Ramchal explains, the only day that Satan has free reign to prosecute is the day of judgment. Judgment is Satan prosecuting, auditing our record. And all of a sudden, we blow that ram's horn. The moment that ram's horn is blown, the prosecution is silenced, because the merit of the Akedah is so overwhelming that nothing could withstand that merit. And the Sultan is silenced, can't talk any further, can't prosecute, regardless of the checkered record that we have. Satan knew this. And he knew that he could have his wings clipped so badly that even with a transplant, there's no way he's ever going to fly again. Satan. But you realize Satan doesn't lose. Even when he loses, he may win at the end of the day. And this I've mentioned. Rambam rules in the laws of Tshuva that if a person is evil his whole life, and the last moment before he passes away, he says, I have regret, remorse, that I ever did all this terrible thing, these terrible things. And if I could do my life over again, I would have never done them. And he has this, he verbalizes the moment before he passes away. That negative record is obliterated. And when he stands before the heavenly tribunal, heavenly court, not a mention of that negative record is mentioned. Because since he has remorse, he made a commitment, never ever do it again, although it was his last breath, the record is cleared. He has a cleared record. What about Rambam says the other way? Person's a devout tzaddik his whole life. And the last moment, for whatever reason, he says, I regret, I have remorse that I ever did any good deed in my life. And I wish I would have never done them. God forbid. If he ever says that, his positive record is obliterated. You know why? Because God doesn't force anything on anybody. God says, I'm willing to give you everything. You don't want it? It's your prerogative. Therefore, the record is actually erased. Not a trace of that record. Now, why was Sora taken by God? So it says explicitly in the Mishnah, in the Midrash. After Avram won the game, Satan is referred to as Samach Mem. That's the ultimate level of impurity, this angel. He was enraged. He was enraged at Avram that he lost. You know what he did? He pays a visit to Sarah. And he says to Sarah Imenu, do you realize what just happened? Do you know what's happening? Your son is on the altar. The son that you gave birth to 37 years ago, your only child, the child that you love more than your own life. And your son, husband has a knife and he's about to cut his throat and bring him as a sacrifice. That's what he says to her. And he's killed him. When Sarah hears this, she begins weeping and wailing, and she expires, she dies. It's too much for her to handle, to take. So because Avram beat him, he's going to show him. So the simple question is, and what do you accomplish? It's like, you become frantic, you have a tantrum, and after you have finished having the tantrum, what have you accomplished? The merit of that Kate is in place. Well, I'm going to show him. I'm going to take his wife. I'm going to take his partner in life. As it says, Avram converted the men to monotheism. Sarah converted the women to monotheism. Satan is enraged. I will show him. I will take his wife. So what have you accomplished? How does that change the equation? So now he's going to be bereft. He's going to be pained. And therefore what? You've accomplished nothing. The answer is no. Avram comes back and he realizes that his wife passed away due to the ultimate accomplishment. that he was willing to bring his son, who was born to him at the age of 100, who's beloved, who's the future of existence, to bring him as a sacrifice. What would the average person say? And then God takes the essence of his life from him, his partner in everything. His wife was even greater than him in prophecy. What would you say? God forbid. God, is this the thank you? Is this the thank you for what I've done? And if God forbid, he would have said, I wish I've never done it. If this is what you do, I wish I would have never done it. If he would have said that, the value of the Kedah is obliterated immediately, wiped out. It's like the tzaddik, as Rambam says, person's devout all his life. And the last moment he says, I have remorse, regret that I did any of this. The record is wiped out, like it never existed. And that's what Sutton tried to accomplish. I will get back at him. He understood the only thing that could get Avram to make that kind of statement is only by taking his wife. Anything other than nothing would have caused that type of response or reaction. What did Avram do? When he heard his wife had passed away, immediately he went to seek out a burial location. Immediately he eulogized her and he cried for her. That's what he did. No reaction. Now the question is why? We say Dayana Emes. Satan could have only taken her, or Samach Mem, only if God allowed it. That's part of a challenge. That's the challenge. Even though it's not one of the 10 tests which Avram was tested, but it was a very serious challenge. If it was meant to be, it was meant to be. Is it painful? Is the pain all-consuming? The answer is yes. But it has nothing to do with what I did. What I did is the will of God, and if that's what God wants, that's the way it is. That's Avram Avinu. But the objective initially to get back at Avram wasn't just to take his wife, because what are you accomplishing? It doesn't undo what Avram accomplished. It's to obliterate the record of Avram. That was the objective. You know, it's interesting. It's suggested it was something written by Nachmanides. You know, when a person at the end of his life, sometimes a person experiences, we're talking about not when a person is not fully competent. He's fully competent. He's rational, he's clear. And because of certain, whatever may filter into his mind and his emotion, he says things which may be unconscionable. May say certain things, you never know. And if a person says things which are really unconscionable, may actually wipe out his whole life's accomplishments. Let's say a person on his deathbed says, you know something? Now the way I see it, the way I feel and everything else, I regret everything my whole life as a Jew. If God forbid a person would say that, what happens? According to Rambam, when he passes away, there's not one mention of one good deed of his whole life. So there's such a thing, it's known as Mesiris Modo. It's called a disclaimer. Every year before Rosh Hashanah, we have the ritual of the nullification of vows. After we nullify what we call Hataras Nedorim, when Mosamodo, we give over it to that same panel, we give over a disclaimer that in the future, if I should make any vow, oath, whatever it may be, I'm saying it has no value. I'm disassociating myself. It has no legal standing. That's called the disclaimer. So the Ramban writes that a person at the end of his life, he should make a disclaimer that anything that comes out of his mouth, which may be inappropriate, it has no value whatsoever, because God forbid, if he should say such a thing, he could put his whole life in jeopardy. In one moment, he could wipe out his whole life. So by making that disclaimer, the person is protecting himself that even if he should make the statement, he's saying in advance, I'm not associated and I don't identify with that statement. Therefore, the person remains secure and whatever his life's accomplishments are, they're intact, not dealt with after he passes away. It's exactly what Satan tried to do with Avram Avinu. But Avram Avinu was undeterred, was not affected by this. we read that Avram, he eulogized her and he cried for her. So the question is, you mean to say when he heard his wife passed away, he didn't cry? Of course he cried. But yet, when we speak about the order, the sequence in the Torah, it says, Lispod l'Sora v'livkosa. He eulogized Sarah and then he cried. Why the hesped precedes the crying? For what reason? Now, there's an expression, ramifications. A person doesn't understand ramifications until he makes an evaluation and takes inventory of certain things. And only then he realizes, for instance, the person has a burglary. It's a terrible thing. And he understands what happened. But only after he assesses what actually happened, then he understands the degree of loss that he had due to that burglary. So lahavdil, Sarah was a mega person, one of a kind of a woman. She's the matriarch of the Jewish people. She's lost, it's his wife. So it's both spiritual partner, physical partner. It's his wife. She passes away. The pain is searing, overwhelming. He cries. But when you eulogize, what exactly is a eulogy? You actually identify and articulate all aspects of that person's value. Once you start articulating it and understanding the essence and the value of what that person is, and now the person's no longer here, and you feel you relate to the true void. Now there's a void which is not imaginable what that void is. One is his wife's not here. Spiritual loss. But when you start articulating and identifying all aspects of Sarah's life, and whatever that was, each aspect itself is something monumental. And combination, it's not to be fathomed. And that's no longer here. That void creates such an overwhelming pain. Therefore, the wailing and the crying follows the eulogy. So initially there was crying, but it's not compared to the crying, what he had cried after he articulated who Sarah Imenu was. The Talmud tells us in Sanhedrin, there's a question. What is the value of a hesped, of a eulogy? Is it kavod hachayim or kavod hamesim? Is it to honor the living or to honor the dead? Honor the living, so the Gemara explains that it's to honor the family. The family prides, because when you go and you describe and identify the life of the deceased, and people understand who the matriarch or the patriarch of that family was, the families now prides themselves that this was their antecedent. So that's to honor the family. That's called kavod hachayim, to honor the living. What's to honor the dead? I mean, the person no longer alive. What's honoring the dead? The answer is because when people appreciate the void and the vacuum by understanding the value of the person, this will actually motivate people and give people an understanding that the slack has to be taken up. People have to fill in the gaps. So people are inspired by understanding the life of the special person, and due to that inspiration, they assume certain behavior modes of behavior, and make commitments to spirituality or acts of loving kind, whatever it may be. So that commitment was due to the inspiration. The inspiration was the life of the person who passed away. All the good that now will be done, although they do it for their own reasons. But what precipitated that? What activated it? It was the inspiration of the persons who passed away. All that goodness accrues to the person who passed away. That's kavod hameis. That's to honor the dead by articulating and identifying, delineating all aspects of the person's life. Ultimately, that person will be beneficiary of all those who were touched by understanding what's no longer here. That's the understanding. But yet, when the Torah writes v'lifkoso, He eulogized her and he cried for her. If you take a look in the Torah or in the Chumash, the kaf is written smaller. It's a small kaf. Why? So there's a beautiful word from the Ksav Sofer that the Ksav Sofer explains that as a human being, we're emotional beings. And when a person is charged at a certain level, regardless of what happens afterwards, although we are affected, but we're affected on a minimal level. I'll give you the example. When Avram realized that he succeeded with the Akedah, why did Avram exist? Why did he live? What was the value of his life? Only to address the objective of creation. God says, I've created this world for my glory. Avram is my glory. Because he will father a nation which is guaranteed eternity, which ultimately will stand at Sinai and accept the Torah unequivocally. Avram understood that. And but when did he achieve that and secure that? At the time of the Akedah. Could you imagine a person winning $1 trillion lottery? And there's nothing you can't do with that type of money. Address every problem of humanity. But you want to know something? It's still not equal to this. Avram succeeding with Akedah, being able to withstand that challenge, his level of accomplishment surpasses anything within the physical realm. This guarantees the eternity of existence. God's glory is secure because it could only come through the Jewish people. Avram, at this moment, what was his level of ecstasy and joy? Not to be described. Not to be described. Now he comes back and he finds out his wife passed away, his partner in life, as special as she is. But you cannot compare it to what he just experienced. He just experienced an accomplishment, a success, which is God's glory at the most advanced level, guaranteeing the existence of a Jewish people. It's just a question of time now. It has to happen. Sinai, it's going to happen. Yaakov will have 12 sons. The Shiftei Kor, the tribes of God. They will be the generators of all these, of this spiritual result. So when he hears that his wife passed away, he was pained. He cried. But his crying was minimized because simultaneously he still was experiencing the ecstasy of the reality what he accomplished. So humanly, it's impossible to come down to that level. He didn't have the capacity to experience the pain that normally he would have experienced. But because at this moment, he's experiencing the reality of what he accomplished, it's impossible to cry fully as he normally would have cried. So that's what the kaf is actually communicating. This is the Ksav Sofer. I'm just embellishing it, but that's what he says. But why is that important why does the Torah have to write the kaf small? Did he cry to his fullest capacity? It was minimized. Why is that important for the Torah to share with us? Anything the Torah tells us, it's something that we're able to, there's a takeaway for us to understand, whether it's to appreciate, whatever it may be. But what's the value for us? We understand, as I just explained it, we understand it. Any human being would have that type of experience. It would actually infringe and minimize his capacity to be able to cry because the pain is somehow occluded due to the special experience. I'll give you an example. You take a person to Rav Shach, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, who was leading Torah sage, and you bring the person in. Person is an ordinary person, observant Jew, but he can't even begin fathoming who Rav Shach is. Can't fathom what the man is. He has a beard. He's an elderly person. He has Torah knowledge. He has a black coat. He has students. And you go and you introduce him. And he's very happy he met this holy rabbi. But does he have the capacity to really internalize who he just met? He has no idea who he just met. I always give you the example. You have the Hope diamond, and you say, see this diamond? It's the most precious diamond in the world. Why is it so precious? Because that's the price tag they gave on it. Because the experts say that's what it is. Do you have an appreciation why it has that innate value? You have no idea. But if you show that diamond to Louis Glick, who says that after 50 years, if he hadn't seen a diamond, he sees it 50 years later, he recognizes that diamond. Because each diamond is unique in terms of its shape, its color, and every aspect of it. When he sees that, he goes crazy when he sees it. It touches him because it's so unique and so special, he can't get over it. Because with all what he's seen in his lifetime, he's never seen anything like it. So Rav Shach, he's a rabbi, little holy or less holy. Could the ordinary person even appreciate what that is? He can't appreciate it. He doesn't even have the capacity to appreciate who Rav Shach is. But if you have a mega Torah sage and he meets him, understands what he knows, what he represents, and what he is, you made his day. That experience, that meeting is one memorial will be memorial for the rest of his life. He will never forget that. And he'll share certain nuances of even the conversation that he had, which the other person just glossed over. Because the person didn't have the capacity to decipher what Rav Shach was saying. When the Torah tells us that he was able to reach a level that he couldn't feel the full pain, didn't have the capacity of the passing of his wife, who was a matriarch, the founding matriarch, who was so special. What does that say about Avraham Avinu's capacity for Kiddush Hashem, to assume that level of assuming responsibility to guarantee the objective of existence? It speaks volumes of Avraham. So the takeaway from the Kaf is, therefore what? What do you mean, therefore what? There's plenty therefore here. This illuminates and gives us a slight understanding who Avram was. Nothing meant anything to Avram. We read, after Sari Menu passed away, it says, the Torah goes and makes a statement, God blessed Avram Bakol, with everything. Well, what's Bakol? Avram was blessed with everything. So Rashi cites the Midrash. The numerical value of Bakol is Ben. He was blessed with a son. He had everything. What does that mean? Avram Avinu had wealth, untold wealth. Avram Avinu had acclaim. The whole world couldn't get over who he was. He was declared the Prince of God. He had everything. But what is everything to Avram? The wealth means nothing. Being proclaimed means nothing. Being acknowledged means nothing. You know what meant everything? I have a son who's my successor. He will assume the mission of my life, which is God's glory. What about all the mega dollars? All the wealth, all the accomplishment? No, you're number one in Forbes 500. Therefore what? You know all the good I could do with all that money? All to Avram meant nothing. Hashem Berach Avram Bakol, Bakol is the son. I have that son who's qualified to be the future patriarch. I have everything. Everything pales to that. Even pale is an understatement of to what degree it has no value. That's Avram Avinu. A man with that capacity, now you understand why, although he lost his life's partner, his wife, he couldn't fully, he didn't have the capacity to fully internalize the pain that he had, because it was overwhelmed with the ecstasy of understanding what he accomplished versus God's glory, that the Jewish people now are secure to become a people and always to be protected, because that merit will silence the prosecution of Satan forever for that reason. We read originally when Avram was told to leave his homeland, his countrymen, and his family, and God says, and there you will have fame, you will have children, you'll have wealth. So Avram arrives, and a God appears to him. And after he appears, it says, Vayiv Mizbeach Lashem Nir Elov. He built an altar for God who appeared to him. So Rashi cites the Medrash. What did God tell him there when he appeared to him? I will give this land to you and your children, to your progeny. So he was informed that he's going to have children. So to commemorate that, now that he knows he's going to have children, what commemorates that communication? Building the altar. However, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh explains it differently, not according to the Midrash. It says he built the altar because God had communicated with him. You know what it means? God communicates with you. But I never had a son. You're going to have a son. You know something? But compared to God, having a personal communication with God, even the son doesn't compare with that. So again, it's not me. It's not Avram. God appeared to him. It's a prophecy. To commemorate that prophecy, in Canaan, he builds the altar. That's what it's about. But that was Avram. Why did Avram go and take on the mightiest kings to save his nephew Lot, as we discussed? He knew he'd be the victor because they didn't realize who Avram's backer was. Avram took on the world single-handedly, even the four mightiest kings. Everybody saw him as the man is demented, irrational, and some kind of crazy fanatic. Avram Avinu knew he wasn't any crazy fanatic. God was his backer, so he's one man against the world. But after he saved his nephew Lot, what was he worried? He was worried that he depleted all his merits, and maybe he has no longer a share in the world to come. You know something? It's like a person goes and he puts all his eggs in one basket, and after he realizes, maybe I should have kept some behind. Because what happens if this deal goes sour? I'm left with nothing. So here, he puts all his eggs in one basket to save Lot, who wasn't such a great guy. He was a bad person. And now he's worried, maybe I've depleted. I'm left with nothing. That's something you should have thought about before you went to war. Because those miracles couldn't have happened unless you had those merits. So why wasn't now you worried about it? So we explained, why did Avram go to battle to save his nephew, who was a bad person? He's a bad guy. He was in Sodom. And he's a man who was an ingrate. He's a man who abandoned his uncle. He says, I have no interest in you. I have no interest in your God. I'm out of here. So we explained, because Lot's father was Haran, was the first human being ever to give his life to sanctify God's name. That was Lot's father. Therefore, he felt he owed it to Haran to be the so-called the guardian for his son, no matter what, at all costs. He knew what it would cost him. It may cost him. But you know something? For a man who sanctifies God's name, the first in the history of the world, I'm willing to give away everything, because that's God's glory. Avram gives it away for God's glory. Now, the famous story with the Vilna Gaon. I told it not long ago, maybe a few months ago, that the Vilna Gaon, his level of scholarship of Torah, his closest students said he's the equivalent of one of the early commentators. And they asked him, which one would you equate him to? He says, maybe the Rashba, Reb Shlomo ben Aderes, who lived hundreds of years before him. And the Vilna Gaon, he would already send out an agent to look for an esrog for him, already right after Shavuos. They needed that special esrog for Sukkos. And the esrog has to be beautiful fruit, shape, color, everything. And he says to his agent, I'm willing to pay anything for it. Whatever it costs, you pay. Now, don't worry about the financial cost. This agent, that year was a bad crop in Israel, very bad crop. And whatever esrog he came upon, he knew it wouldn't meet the Vilna Gaon standard. Finally, his agent heard that there's a very wealthy man, And a certain city had purchased that special esrog. He goes to that city and he says, could you show me the esrog? I'm an agent of the Vilna Gaon. Could you show me that special esrog? He shows him. He's like amazed. The beauties, this would meet the Vilna Gaon standard of what the esrog should be. And the person says, I want to buy it from you. I'm willing to pay whatever it costs. I'm willing to pay the price. Man says it's not for sale. I'm a very wealthy man. I don't need the money. Don't need the money. But he says, you realize, but it's for the Vilna Gaon. He says, it's irrelevant. I want the mitzvah. And being so special, I want it for myself. It's not for sale. And the agent kept pestering the man. He didn't let up because he knows he has to come home with that special esrog. And he pesters him and he's on top of him. And finally, the man says, on one condition, I'm willing to sell only for one price. If the Vilna Gaon gives me his share in the world to come for the esrog, it's his. Okay? Anything less than that, it's not for sale. The man says, you got a deal. They shake on the deal. The esrog cost the Vilna Gaon his share in the world to come. You know what the Vilna Gaon share in the world to come was? He was the equivalent of a living angel. You just read about his life, what he was. And he's very happy he's coming back to the Vilna Gaon with a special esrog. But the agent is shaking in his boots. Because really, when he tells the Vilna Gaon what it cost him, he may get a reaction that he'll regret that he ever gave his share in the world to come for that esrog. So finally he comes to Vilna Gaon, he's amazed. He says, what did it cost? He says, it cost your share in the world to come. So you know what the Vilna Gaon says? Thank God, now I could at least do a mitzvah selflessly, not for the sake of reward. That was the Vilna Gaon's response. You know what it says in Pirkei Avos? You should serve the master for the sake of the master, not for the sake of reward. So what does it say about the Vilna Gaon? Now I could do it for the sake of the mitzvah. It's all God's glory. It has nothing to do with me. I'm not the beneficiary here. It's not so I should be a beneficiary. I'm here for one reason, for God's glory. Avram is here for one reason, for God's glory, no other glory. No other reason. Not the wealth, not the wife, not the nothing. Whatever is God's glory, that's my value. Outside of that, when I am a beneficiary, not a beneficiary, it's all irrelevant. All that matters is God's glory. When the Torah goes and tests to Avram, he blessed Avram with everything. What's everything? He has a whole portfolio, real estate, herds, flocks, cash, gold. He owns Fort Knox. That's not Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu, Bakol, numerically is Ben. He has Yitzchak. He has everything. Why is that everything? Because Yitzchak is God's glory. Because that guarantees the future of the Jewish people. We know that Avram went into the kiln and came out of the kiln. Why did Avram merit to come out of the kiln and Haran, his brother, did not? So the Midrash cites a verse that the reason why Avram came out of the kiln is because he was redeemed by Yaakov, his grandson. Because there had to be a Yaakov, Avram could not perish in that kiln. Because if he would have perished, what would have been? There wouldn't have been a Yitzchak. If there wouldn't have been a Yitzchak, there's no Yaakov. So because there had to be the third patriarch, who's the most special, who's going to father the 12 tribes, therefore Avram merited the miracle to come out of the kiln. But who's Yaakov? Yaakov is the most special of the patriarchs. He's the ultimate Kiddush Hashem. He's the most beloved to God of all the patriarchs. So in his merit, Avram came out of the kiln. So what was the value of Yitzchak? It's everything. Bakol. Yitzchak means there's going to be a Yaakov. Without a Yitzchak, there's no Yaakov. You can have all the money in the world. I remember many years ago, Edmund Safra, which I knew, and I set a share in his bank for 11 years, the Republic Bank in New York, and he was written up in the Time magazine, and Edmund Safra had no children. And they asked him, you have no children. So what is the value of your life? So you know what he said, and it's way back, a long time ago. So it said in the article, my banks are my children. Those are his words. My banks are my children. It was known that Safra had on Fifth Avenue in the main branch, in the vaults under the subterranean, I don't know how much, maybe he had $1 billion worth of gold, just gold. That's how much gold he had there. His banks are his children. So what happens at the end of the day? His attendant creates a fire, dies of smoke inhalation, and what did he leave over? He left over his children. Now where do you go with the banks? You go nowhere with the banks. You leave over a successor, and he's able to carry on your work. It's a whole different reality. That's what it's about. Yitzchak is Bakol. Why is Yitzchak Bakol? Because Yitzchak is Yaakov. Because Yitzchak fathered the ultimate patriarch, which was the basis why he came out of the kiln and his brother did not come out of the kiln. That's living for God's glory. The Vilna Gaon, he says, Baruch Hashem, I finally could do a mitzvah selflessly. He cost him his whole world to come. It's okay. But you know what? Want to know the reality? When he made that statement was worth more than his whole world to come that he bought that esrog for. Because that's exactly the ultimate level a person has to achieve. Moshe Rabbeinu said, what am I? Nachnu mo. What was Moshe's value? It's not him. He's nothing. All that matters is God's glory. And that's his claim to fame. He was Eved Hashem. What's an Eved? A slave, a servant. A servant's value is only the master. Every fiber, every nuance of his intellect, his emotion, his function is to serve the master. And that's what Avram, Hashem Berech Avram Bakol, that's what it's about. Avram goes to purchase the Marsa Machpelah to bury his wife. Pays a fortune. Ephron, the original owner, is a very bad person. Envious, evil eye. Called person. Eagle eye, this guy's evil eye. Evil eye Ephron. The numerical value of Ephron with the vav deleted is ayin ra. Evil eye. When he saw Avram's wealth, his envy was totally all-consuming. And he said, he's going to pay for this purchase. And he paid a fortune. And Avram was happy to pay for it. And he purchased it to bury his wife, Sora. And Avram knew that Adam and Eve was buried in that location. And ultimately, it was the burial location for Yitzchak and Rivka, and for Yaakov and Leah. That's what it was, the city of the four couples. The most special couples existed in the history of existence are buried in that location. The four couples. Avram, he personifies chesed, loving kindness. Until Sarah passed away, he was involved, his thrust was chesed. He hosted people at an unbelievable level. The Talmud tells us that Suda Shlomo B'Shaito, the banquet of Shlomo Melech at the height of his power, wasn't the equivalent of the way he would host his guests. That was the extent of his chesed. But when he purchased the burial location for his wife, God says to him, it's a Yalkut, which is a compilation of Medrash says, God says, finally, you're doing my kind of chesed. Finally, after all these years, finally, you're wearing my cloak of chesed. That's all it says in the Medrash. What is it all about? I mean, Avram Avinu, he breathed it, he lived it. Even on the third day after he was circumcised, when he saw the angels, he ran towards them. The wound wasn't healed. He was dripping blood. This was his dedication to chesed. And God says, now finally, when you purchase the burial plot for your wife, now finally you're assuming my persona of chesed. And until now, what is it? We see what we benefited. the clouds of glory, the Mun, the wellspring of Miriam, so evidently it was chesed. Now, what was the objective of Avram's chesed? Avram only lived and breathed chesed and personified chesed. It wasn't for the sake of chesed. It wasn't for the sake of doing indiscriminate kindness. He used it as a vehicle to espouse monotheism. When God does chesed, when God brought existence into existence, it was for what reason? So mankind should be the beneficiary, if he succeeds, the beneficiary of the ultimate reward, having a relationship with him. So therefore it was chesed for the sake of chesed. It was chesed, that's what it was. Avram's chesed that he had done was only a vehicle to bring people into his home and to host them at this elaborate level that when he finishes with the dialogue, he becomes a monotheist. The first time in Avram's life that he did chesed for the sake of chesed, Sora Taken needed a burial location, a special burial location. He left no stone unturned to purchase that location. For her, this was chesed for her. God says, finally you've arrived. Finally you're doing my kind of chesed. And therefore God says, finally now you're wearing my cloak. My cloak of chesed, now you're wearing my cloak. Until now, it was a means, it wasn't an end unto itself. Now it's an end unto itself, it's for the sake of the person. Therefore now you've achieved that special level of identifying with me as who I am. Now what's interesting, there's a Zohar, which the Chavetz Chaim cites in his work, Loving Kindness, Avos Chesed, that if a Jew does chesed on a special level, God announces to his whole heavenly retinue, and he says, my children need chesed. My children need chesed. And although they need chesed, they do chesed. So I, who am the master of chesed, I shouldn't do chesed. My children who are in need of chesed, they do chesed. So I, the master of chesed, I shouldn't do chesed. Therefore, what God does, that all the chesed, which he now will to the whole world, is the merit of that one person who did that exceptional chesed. Could you imagine? If you do something unusual in a special way within the realm of chesed, you can activate a chesed which is on a global level. Because God, this is God's takeaway. When the person does that chesed, what's the chesed he's doing? My children who need chesed, because every human, it's Mechalka Chaim bechesed, we say in the Amidah. God sustains life with chesed. Without chesed, the world can't continue. The base elements. And they do chesed, although they're in need of chesed every moment of their existence. I, who am the master of it, I shouldn't do chesed. So when we speak about, you can't evaluate the value of a mitzvah. The man gave $100,000 to feed poor people, which makes a major difference in their lives. They could function, maintain themselves with dignity within the context of being observant Jews. What's the value? 100,000. Schar b'hayal malekor. You can't evaluate that is because it's spiritual. It's much more than that. Now, if you invest 100,000 and you have a $3 trillion return, what kind of investment is that? There's no words to describe what that investment is. If you're chesed, being God says, now the whole world will be sustained through my chesed due to the merit of this one individual. So what is the return on that chesed that this one individual did? It's not to be fathomed. But that chesed the person is chesed for chesed. God's doing chesed to the world, so the world should be beneficiaries. Because he did it, so others should be beneficiaries. Just to give us an understanding, when you put even a penny in that stucker box, or we call it the pushka, it's a penny. But if you put it in with the right intention, and you give it to the right poor man, for him, because you want to help him, you never know what that activates. It's like flicking a switch, and that switch has endless ramifications, one after another, till the other ends of the world. You never know. Only God knows. But we have to do what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to do chesed. And especially, the Navi says, We don't turn a blind eye on our flesh. We say there's an expression, charity begins at home. We have to worry about ourselves. Family comes first. And you have to have, but what about that cause, that cause? You understand? The first cause is the Jewish cause. We're responsible to ourselves. And that's the first of, could you imagine supporting a stranger where your brother's starving to death? God forbid. We're talking about your brother who's your genetic brother. You share your siblings. It's cruelty. How do you give to someone else before you help your brother? Identically, a Jew is a brother. But I don't even know how we're related. It's irrelevant how you're related. You're part of the same people. You're both Jews. And that is the ultimate chesed. As we said earlier, when Avram Avinu became the complete person after circumcision, the same act of kindness, it's a different dimension. Because he himself is a reflection of that Tzelem Elokim. The Tzelem Elokim is doing the chesed. When we do chesed for Tzelem Elokim, and we being the Tzelem Elokim, it's a different dimension of accomplishment, although it says, well, you get the same tax write-off in terms of the IRS. It's irrelevant. It's the beneficiary and the endower who brings it about. To be continued.